Welcome to Conspiracy Q, listener. Tonight, we're diving into a top secret investigation that'll really make you question everything you thought you knew about one of the biggest bands, ever.
The Beatles.
The Beatles. Okay, so forget everything, just for a second. Okay, forget everything the mainstream media has told you about the Beatles, because we had some recently uncovered sources. They suggest something pretty wild. It's about Paul McCartney. This is big,
Yeah.
listener. These sources are suggesting that that Paul McCartney, he might have actually died.
Died?
Yeah, like all the way back in 1966. And get this, they replaced him, secretly replaced him.
That's right. We're going deep tonight into something called the Paul Is Dead Dossier. It's basically a whole collection of documents and supposed evidence laying out this whole incredible claim. We'll be walking through the whole thing, the timeline they give, the clues they say are hidden like right there in the Beatles' music, their album art, all that. And then there's supposed inconsistencies in Paul's appearance, even his behavior after this 1966 date. Oh, and it's even crazier. We're talking about possible government involvement in all of this. I mean, just wow. But just to be clear, we're not here to say any of this is, definitely true. We're here to lay it all out, show you what this dossier says, and let you decide for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. We just want to take you through this dossier, examine what it claims.
Yeah.
No pressure. Just think about it with us. So, all right, let's just jump right in. The dossier starts off with a pretty dramatic event, doesn't it? I mean, it sets the whole Paul is dead thing in motion right from the beginning.
It really does. Okay, so picture this. November 9th, 1966. That's the big date, according to this top secret investigation. The story goes that there was some kind of argument, some disagreement at the recording studio. They don't really go into detail about what it was about, but, tensions were high. And then Paul, well, he just takes off. He leaves the studio and gets into his Aston Martin, the fancy car.
And it's pouring rain, right? It's like really bad weather. This is all according to the dossier, remember? And then, well, the worst happens. Paul's in a car accident, a fatal one.
Yeah, a really bad crash. The dossier doesn't hold back on the details here. They're claiming he was decapitated, that his injuries were, well, so severe that they couldn't even identify him. And there's another tragic element to this. There was a young woman, a fan of the band, and she was either, hitching a ride with Paul, or maybe she was already in the car with him, but she died in the crash too. The dossier even says that she might have been distracting him, leading to the accident. Terrible.
It's a really sad story if it's true, and then, well, the cover-up. That's where it gets crazy. The dossier claims the whole thing was covered up because they were afraid of mass hysteria. Can you imagine? I mean, the Beatles were huge, absolutely massive. They were everywhere. They were like a phenomenon.
Right, a global phenomenon. They were like more than just a band, The dossier calls them a key element of British soft power. Like, they were representing Britain on the world stage, and losing Paul, one of the main guys, the songwriter, the face of the band, well, it could have had a huge impact, psychologically, economically, even politically, maybe. It was a different time,
Totally. The world was watching, and the Beatles were like the symbol of, I don't know, youth and hope and change. And the dossier is saying that British intelligence, MI5, and EMI Records, their label, they worked together to cover it all up. That's a huge claim, isn't it? MI5 involved in a Beatles conspiracy. It's hard to believe.
It's mind-blowing, right? But that's what the dossier says. And then it gets even weirder. They claim there was a secret contest to find someone to replace Paul. Like, imagine that. A Paul McCartney replacement contest, all hush-hush, top secret.
Sounds like something out of a movie. And they found someone, right? The dossier says they actually found a guy who could pull it off.
They did. The dossier says they found this guy from Canada, a musician named William Shears Campbell. And get this, he looked a lot like Paul McCartney. Like, a lot. He even won a Paul McCartney look-alike contest once before all of this.
So this William Shears Campbell, who the dossier also calls Billy Shears, or, get this fall, F-A-U-L for fake Paul, they're saying this guy had, surgery, voice coaching, even dental work to make him more like Paul. And then they carefully managed his public appearances so no one would suspect anything. That's pretty elaborate, wouldn't you say?
Totally elaborate. And that brings us to, well, I think the coolest part of this whole Paul is dead thing. The clues, the supposed clues that are hidden in the Beatles' music and album art. The dossier spends a lot of time on this, decoding all these hidden messages about Paul's alleged death.
All right, let's break it down. First up, Steve Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That iconic album from 1967. The dossier comes right out and says it. The whole album is a funeral for the real Paul McCartney. Like, that's their concept, a big, elaborate musical funeral.
And they point to specific things like the second track, with a little help from my friends, Billy Shears is introduced in that song, right? Well, the dossier says it wasn't just, part of the album's concept. It was a symbolic introduction of the replacement Paul, right there in the music. They were hiding him in plain sight. Remember, bands back then were doing all sorts of crazy stuff with alter egos and costumes and theatrics, so it wasn't totally out of place.
And that album cover, whoa, that album cover, it's like a collage of faces, so many people. But the dossier says it's not just random, it's a carefully arranged memorial scene, like everyone's standing over a grave. And then there's the flowers. Right, the flowers arranged like a left-handed bass guitar. Paul played the bass, left-handed.
Yeah, and the detail they focus on, it's kind of crazy. There are 3 yellow hyacinths, and they make up the guitar strings, but there's a space for a 4th one,
Yeah.
Like it's missing. The dossier says it represents the missing Beatle, the original Paul, the gap left in the band.
It's creepy, right? And then there's a doll on the cover. Someone's holding a doll, and it's holding a toy Aston Martin. Remember, Paul allegedly died in a car crash in Aston Martin. And it has a red interior, the toy car. Such a specific detail. And next to the doll, a blood-stained glove. I mean, come on. It's like they're trying to tell us something, isn't it?
You can't help but notice these things once you start looking for them. And there's even a Shirley Temple doll on the cover. And she's wearing this sweater that says, "Welcome the Rolling Stones." The dossier wonders if that was some kind of message, some kind of warning,
Yeah.
about the Beatles changing, or maybe even about the whole music scene at the time.
Okay, next album, Magical Mystery Tour. This one has a film, too, and there's this scene where they're all wearing animal masks, the Beatles. The dossier zeroes in on Paul. He's the only one wearing a black walrus mask. What's up with that, according to the Paul Is Dead theory?
Well, the walrus, in some stories from Norse mythology, it represents death, like death and change. So they're saying that Paul wearing that mask is another hint, another subtle nod to, his supposed death and the new Paul taking his place.
And they analyze that album cover, too. Remember the stars above the word Beatles? Well, the dossier says if you look at it in a mirror, the stars spell out 5317428. And then get this, if you rearrange those numbers, you get 28IF, like 28 if he had lived. Paul would have been 28. It's a bit of a stretch maybe, but it's there,
And in I Am the Walrus, that song, as it fades out, you can hear a radio playing faintly in the background. It's a line from Shakespeare, King Lear. "Oh, untimely death." It's creepy, right? Even if they didn't mean to put it there, it's just, it fits the theory so well.
Then we get to the White Album. The dossier claims things get even more direct on this one with the lyrics. John Lennon's song, Glass Onion, it has that line. Here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul. I mean, come on, that's pretty clear, isn't it?
It seems that way, right? The walrus was Paul. The dossier sees it as a confession almost, or at least a deliberate clue. But then Lennon was always writing these weird cryptic lyrics, so who knows? Maybe it meant something else entirely.
And then Ringo's song on the album, Don't Pass Me By, it has that line, you were in a car crash and you lost your hair. I mean, given the whole car crash story in the dossier, it's a bit creepy, right? Maybe Ringo knew something.
It's definitely a line that jumps out at you when you know about the theory. And then there's the whole backmasking thing. Remember backmasking? Playing a record backwards and hearing hidden messages. Well, the dossier claims that if you play Revolution 9 backwards, you can hear, "Turn me on, dead man." Spooky.
Yeah.
Whether they put it there on purpose or if it's just, random sounds that our brains interpret as words, who knows?
Abbey Road, that iconic album cover with them walking across the street. The dossier says it's not just them crossing the street, it's a funeral procession, like a symbolic funeral procession.
Yeah, and they assign roles to each Beatle. John, in white, he's the priest, the religious figure. Ringo, in his black suit, he's the undertaker. And Paul, barefoot, out of step with the others, eyes closed, he's the dead one. And George, in denim, they say he's the gravedigger.
And they point out that Paul's the only one holding a cigarette, and he's holding it in his right hand. But Paul was left-handed? That's weird, right? And of course, that Volkswagen Beetle in the background, the license plate says 28IF. That number, again, 28 if he had lived. It's a lot to take in, all these visual details they focus on.
A lot of clues, supposed clues. And it's not just the visuals. The dossier analyzes the lyrics, too. Looking for hidden meanings that point to Paul's death.
Like a day in the life with that line about the man who blew his mind out in a car fits the car crash story, right? The dossier makes that connection.
And then there's She's Leaving Home, a song about a young woman running away. The dossier says it's like a parallel story to the young fan who died with Paul, She was leaving home too, but in a much more tragic way.
And Fixing a Hole? The dossier interprets that song as being about the surgery they supposedly did on William Campbell, the replacement Paul, to make him look more like the original Paul. They even take that line, "I'm taking the time for a number of things that weren't important yesterday," and say it's about reconstructive surgery. It's a bit of a reach, maybe, but that's their interpretation.
And then The Fool on the Hill, they see that song as being about Paul himself. Like he was misunderstood, isolated, and then silenced by his alleged death. It's kind of a sad interpretation of that song, but it fits their narrative.
Moving on from the music and artwork, the dossier also presents what they say are physical differences in Paul's appearance before and after 1966. They get really detailed here, comparing photographs and pointing out all these little things.
Yeah, they claim that there are subtle differences in his face, even his height. They say the original Paul was shorter than George Harrison, but then the new Paul seems taller. Little things like that, things that you might not notice unless you were really looking for them.
And his ears. They analyze the shape of his ears in photos, talking about the tragus and the way his earlobes attach. They say there are differences, implying it's a different person. It's a bit obsessive, maybe, but it's part of their whole argument.
And the teeth. That's a big one for them. They say the original Paul had crooked teeth, but then in later pictures, his teeth are perfectly straight. Like maybe he had a lot of dental work done to change his smile. It's definitely something you notice if you look at enough pictures of them.
And there are even stories about the post-1966 Paul forgetting things, like details about his life before 1966. The dossier presents these as evidence that it's a different person, someone who doesn't have the same memories.
It all adds up, according to them. All these little physical inconsistencies, they're supposed to prove that something changed, that it's not the same Paul.
And then it gets even darker. The dossier talks about disappearing witnesses and, get this, silenced whistleblowers. People who knew the truth, but they were either eliminated or silenced somehow.
Yeah, they bring up Tara Brown, a friend of the Beatles. He died in a car crash not long after Paul's supposed death. The dossier calls it a suspicious coincidence, like maybe he knew too much. And there's Mal Evans, the Beatles' road manager. He was writing a tell-all book, but he was shot and killed by the LAPD just days before the book was supposed to come out. The dossier implies that he was silenced to protect the secret.
And even Heather Mills, Paul's ex-wife, she's mentioned, the dossier quotes her talking about a huge secret about Paul. And she even said that people wouldn't be able to handle the truth. But then she stopped talking about it. It's like, what did she know? Why wouldn't she tell us?
It's all very suspicious, isn't it? Like there are these powerful forces at work keeping the truth hidden. And speaking of powerful forces, the dossier actually suggests that the government might have been involved in the cover-up. MI5, the CIA, maybe even both. That takes this whole thing to a whole other level.
Yeah, it gets pretty wild. The dossier points out that the Beatles were being watched by both MI5 and the CIA back then. I mean, they were a huge cultural force, right? They were influencing young people all over the world, and governments don't like that kind of thing. They want control.
Right. Control the narrative, control the culture. And so the theory is that maybe the government saw the Beatles as a tool, for spreading their message, their ideology. And if Paul died, well, they couldn't let that stop their plans, so they replaced him. It's a crazy idea, but it makes you think.
And they point out that there was no official denial for a long time. Like, even when the Paul is dead, rumors were everywhere. No one came out and said, no, it's not true. He's fine. That's kind of weird, right? If it was just a crazy rumor, you'd think they would have shut it down right away. But they didn't.
And the dossier brings up another interesting idea. Psychological warfare. Some people believe that the Beatles, or maybe the people behind them, planted all these clues on purpose, like a big experiment, to see how much they could manipulate the public, to see if they could make people believe something that wasn't true.
Like they were messing with us, playing with our heads. The dossier even mentions interviews where the new Paul acted weird, like he was nervous or uncomfortable, and he even made jokes about being dead. It's like, were they trying to tell us something?
And there's that famous quote from Paul himself, "If I were dead, I'd be the last to know." In the context of this theory, it sounds pretty creepy, doesn't it? Like he's in on the joke, or maybe he's trapped in this charade and can't break free.
The dossier also mentions that the different Beatles, sometimes they gave conflicting stories in interviews, like they couldn't get their story straight. And George Harrison, they say he got really uncomfortable whenever anyone brought up the Paul is dead stuff. And then there's Ringo. Years later, he said something like, "We all felt guilty about it, but it was the only way to keep going." That's a pretty suggestive quote, wouldn't you say?
Guilty about what? What did they have to keep going? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? And the dossier even talks about the psychological impact on the guy who was supposedly replacing Paul, William Campbell. Imagine that, stepping into the shoes of one of the most famous people on the planet after a tragedy like that.
It's a lot to handle, right? The dossier wonders if he started to lose himself in the role, if he became Paul McCartney without even realizing it. They point out times when he acted strange, like he couldn't remember things or he seemed confused. Maybe it was all just too much for him.
It's like, if you pretend to be someone for long enough, do you eventually become that person? It's a mind-bending thought, isn't it? And then the dossier wraps up by emphasizing just how many clues there are. Hundreds of them, they say. Spread across all the albums, the lyrics, even Paul's appearance and behavior. It's overwhelming, all the evidence they present.
It's a lot to take in. And they say that even if you don't believe the whole replacement thing, you can't deny that something changed, The original Paul, he was gone, in a way. Whether he literally died or not, something shifted and a new persona emerged. It's a fascinating idea, even if it's not true.
And the dossier doesn't end there. They have this epilogue where they talk about new evidence that's come out recently, like even the last couple of years. It's like this theory keeps evolving, finding new life in the digital age.
Oh, really? They're still finding clues, even now?
Apparently so. They mentioned this analysis from 2023 where they used artificial intelligence to analyze Paul's voice, comparing recordings from before and after 1966. And they found differences, subtle changes in his vocal timbre. Some people say it proves it was a different person singing. It's kind of cool how they're using technology to investigate this old mystery.
AI and the Beatles. That's a weird combination, but it kind of makes sense. And there's more, right? The dossier mentions Paul McCartney's documentary from 2022, McCartney 3-2-0. What about it?
Well, they point out that there's no mention of 1966 in the whole documentary. It jumps from the early years straight to So She Pepper. Like they're deliberately avoiding that year, that time period. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are they hiding?
Yeah, that's pretty suspicious, skipping over a whole year like that.
Yeah.
And then at the very end of the dossier, there's this classified addendum. It's short, just 2 sentences. What do they say?
The first one is that classic line from the Paul is Dead theory. The walrus was Paul. But then the second sentence, it throws a curveball. It says, but maybe the walrus never was.
Whoa, what does that even mean? Like, even the clues aren't real. Are they saying it's all a lie? Even the conspiracy theories? My head's spinning.
It's like they're saying, don't trust anything, not even what we've told you. It's a final twist, a final layer of mystery. It makes you wonder, what is the truth? Is there even a truth?
So, listener, what you think? We've gone through it all, the whole Paul Is Dead dossier, the timeline, the clues, the physical changes, the disappearing witnesses, the government involvement, even the psychological stuff. It's a lot to process.
Is it a hoax? A cover-up? Something even stranger? We don't have the answers, but we've given you the information. Now it's up to you to decide.
Go back and listen to the Beatles, look at their album covers, their photos, their interviews, see what you notice. Maybe you'll find something we missed, another clue, another piece of the puzzle.
And who knows, maybe you'll uncover the truth. Or maybe, just maybe, there is no truth. Just an endless maze of mystery.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Q. Rate and follow us to keep up with all the latest top-secret investigations. We're out there digging for the truth, and we'll keep bringing it to you every week. Stay skeptical, stay curious, and keep questioning everything.